Okay, the Swedish roots are mainly on my father's side of the family. His parents both came to the United States from Sweden separately, one at age 12, one at age 25. My grandmother was called to take care of a cousin's children after his wife had died, and he wrote to Sweden and said, send Tilly over to take care of my kids, which she did. But when he remarried, the second wife and Tilly, I understand, clashed. And so Tilly found employment in the home of Judge and Mrs. John Milton Scott. The Scott home is where the city of Bloomington City Hall is today. Going back to my grandmother, she was probably very much of the old country. Her best English slogan was, "Be quiet in church," and she preferred Swedish. Anytime she could visit with someone, she would lighten up and talk and speak Swedish and talk to her friends, and she was a little hesitant to be an English speaker. Like many of the ethnic groups, the Swedes were pretty tightly knit because of their language, and they were hated when they arrived in Bloomington because they did not know they were strikebreakers at the coal mine. One of the things that we wouldn't think about necessarily today, but as a coal miner, in the winter, it was dark when you went down in the mine, and it was dark when you came up from the mine. So the only day of the week that you saw sunlight was on Sunday. I'd hate to try that sometime. I think the weeks would get awfully long, especially at $3.50 or $4 a day. And the church dues at that time were $4 a year for an adult man, and $2 for an adult woman. So for $6 a year, you were a member of the Swedish Lutheran Church. I can remember when the church first started the English services, I think in 1921. By 1923, they were all English. But I can remember Axel Olsen speaking to the youngsters who were lobbying for more English in the church, that if Swedish was okay with Jesus, it ought to be okay for you. My grandfather came to the United States with a completed apprenticeship in cabinet making and woodworking and so forth. He worked at the Morat's mill. In those days, your doors and windows and things were made in the mill, not on the job. And to have a mill locally, it was very convenient. He would walk to work each day from 905 West Olive Street, which was their home that he built for his bride, and raised 3 children there, one being my father, the middle child. My father went through the Bloomington school system. He was stopped in 1918 by the Spanish flu for a while, and then a few months in the Army, and then he returned the following fall to the University of Illinois, where he graduated in architecture in 1923. He came back to Bloomington and joined the firm of A.L. Pillsbury in the People's Bank Building. Unfortunately, Mr. Pillsbury was killed in an auto accident coming back from a football game in Champaign. This was very sudden, of course, and they discovered that my father, who had recently graduated 2 years before, had been registered by the state of Illinois and licensed to practice architecture, which none of the others had, as they had been practicing under Mr. Pillsbury's license. So they reorganized the firm, which they had to do, and the attorney set it up for my father's name to be first because he was the one licensed. And that didn't suit the senior people very much, and I can understand why. So it was shortly changed to the name of the senior people, followed by E. Lundeen, registered architect, and that's took care of it, but it still gave them back their seniority. He and Mr. Rosen left the associates in, I believe, 1937. Yeah, and they moved to the Corn Belt Bank building. There was a division of the work that was in process, and agreements to assist back and forth between the two offices as needed. Anyway, following that, he taught at Bloomington High School, 1943 and maybe part of 44, drafting and so forth, and also the electrical. And as I remember, they were in the Army, in the trade school downtown here, where they were training, and some would come up and take classes. Well, and during that time, there was no building. There were a few back porches that went on, but there were, lumber wasn't available, even nails were scarce. Paper clips were scarce. But he would go to the school boards, and they would keep up to their requirements. So there were a lot of plans that were made and partially approved for when they could build. And the schools got some priorities, probably before any personal housing. In Bloomington, it's sort of funny. You go out on East Emerson, and the Unitarian Church is there, and next to it is St. John's Lutheran Church, which they did, and then across the street and further down is the Jewish Temple, and then they also did the Episcopal Church on East Oakland Avenue, and Wesley Methodist downtown with the tall tower. He was pro bono to the extent that he could, but he couldn't do it on the firm's time, or they would have to charge for it. There was a dentist who was a member of the church who told Dad to be sure to build a steeple big enough for a carillon, that he wanted to contribute a carillon bells to the church. Well, that was until October 29th, I think it was, 1929, and he called and had to renege on his promise. And so there is a single bell up in that large belfry on the church, and it's still there. The Majestic Theater was a vaudeville theater, and during the 20s it was very active. Well, vaudeville days were over, so they finally closed it, and it was eventually demolished. Anyway, when they talked about an organ, it was in probably about 1939 for our church on Olive and Allen. The pastor Westberg, who was here, he later became famous for holistic medicine, but he said it'd be so nice to have a pipe organ in the church. Julius Nordeen, again a relative, and a later councilman on the city council, and his brother Fritz Nordeen was here, and Fritz said, I bet you there's an old organ in the Majestic and the Castle Theater. And they checked, and yeah, there were. So they said, let's wonder if we could get permission to get in and inspect those and see if they could be used in the church, which they did. And Fred Hunt, Mildred Lundeen's husband, who was an organ builder, among other things, checked them out, and he said the Barton organ in the Majestic could be used. And so they negotiated with Balaban and Katz Theater Company in Chicago to take the organ out of there. And the church members hit the place like ants on an anthill, and they started carrying pipes. Well, where do we put them? Where is this? The only thing they didn't really bring was the elevator that lifted the organ out of the basement area and would bring it up to into the orchestra pit, so everybody could see playing the organ. I worked all summer cleaning the electromagnets under every pipe section. I even wore out the top of my overhauls because I would clean them on there and went through. But by the end of the summer, The organ was working and it was dedicated in September of '41. Then Uncle Fred, who had completed this installation, his middle name was Barton, and the organ was a Barton organ. And I asked him, "Are you related?" "Oh, no." That's all he said. Axel Olsen lived on a farm, and he was from Sweden. One day he was chopping wood, and a piece took out his eye. He was the man who would butcher a hog, and they'd make potatiscore, potatoes and meat, and put it in the casings of the hog, and then he would bring it to the church, and there'd be a big church supper. The church suppers were to die for. My father broke a tooth, I remember one night. He was late in getting there, and then they'd turned the lights down, and they had served a half a grapefruit with a little candle in it. But we also had a candle holder made out of plaster of Paris that it was in. Well, by the time he got there, the candle had burned down and it was out, and the tables were pretty dark. And all of a sudden, he'd bitten on this, isn't it funny how you remember some of those stories? Another story he would tell is that he was confirmed at age 13. That would have been in about 1911, and he twisted the buttons. He was so nervous he had to be confirmed in English and Swedish because the Swedes had to ask him questions, and he was so nervous that he twisted the button off of his new coat that his mother had made for him. Education was a very strong part of the Swedish thinking, and they just encouraged that as much as possible. In 1954, the church had been without a pastor and for several years, and the congregation, I'm guessing, was probably about 350 people plus kids. And this seminarian arrived after 2 or 3 had been there to preach, and everyone really liked him. And they called him to come to the church when he graduated, which he did. Now, everyone assumed he was a good Swede because he just sounded like a Swede. He was everything about him, but no one ever asked or questioned. Well, it was 2 years before he had the shall we say, the fortitude to say, "Now, I've never said anything to this congregation, but my background is Norwegian." I remember everyone applauded, so that was fine. But that was Pastor Skilrud, who was here for 25 years and then went to Atlanta, Georgia, and was bishop of the southeastern United States. And had several meetings with the Pope. We were talking about my Norwegian wife. We've gotten along now for 68 years very nicely. We sometimes argue whether, as they said, what's dumber than a dumb Swede, a smart Norwegian. And we actually visited Denmark and Sweden. And I think all in all, any difference that there was in Europe between the Swedes and the Norwegians, I know the countries changed geographically a little bit, had disappeared, and the only place we found any, and it wasn't anger, but any differences is in those who came over from the old country and the descendants of that. We have to keep that tradition going of the Swedes and the Norwegians.